Welcome to Module 1, Communication at Work, Creating Messages that Connect with and Persuade People. So a quick overview of Module 1. By the end of this module, you will understand how workplace communication is changing today. You will also know and understand how the communication process works using what's called the communication feedback loop. You'll recognize how to effectively and ethically persuade audiences using what is known as the business communication hierarchy of needs, and then you'll learn the 5 pillars of emotional intelligence and identify how those pillars will make you a better communicator. So in concert with these learning objectives, this module is broken into 4 different segments. Segment 1.1 will talk about business communication today. Segment 1.2, how communication works. 1.3, audience persuasion and ethical information. 1.4, emotional intelligence and communication. So in 1.1, we will learn about how culture and globalization is changing the way we communicate today. We'll also talk through things like technology, visual communication, and empathy and inclusion as a big component of communication in the workplace. In Module 1.2, then we'll talk about how communication works using the communication feedback loop. We'll walk through how to overcome the 7 types of noise, and we'll identify some key strategies for reducing noise. Then in Module 1.3, we'll talk about how our audience's triune brain affects the way that they interpret information. We'll look at the business communication hierarchy of needs and break down different elements of making your communications more impactful and persuasive. We'll talk about situation, persuasive, and exigence. And lastly, we'll talk about how to persuade, not manipulate when you communicate. And then lastly, in 1.4, we will talk about emotional intelligence. We'll define what that means and talk about its purpose in communication and the workplace. And then we're going to walk through the 5 pillars of emotional intelligence: awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills. And then lastly, we'll connect the dots between emotional intelligence and communication. All right, so that's what you can expect in Module 1. Let's go ahead and move into the next video, 1.1, Business Communication Today. Module 1.1, Business Communication Today. In this segment, we're going to just look at some big overarching themes when it comes to the way communication is changing in the workplace today. I want to start with a couple of thoughts from some experts in the field. This one comes from Nancy Duarte, author of Resonate. She says, quote, "Getting ahead of the next curve requires courage and communication. Courage to determine the next bold move and communication to keep the troops committed to the value of moving it forward. Rallying stakeholders to move together in a common course of action is all a part of the innovation and survival process. Leaders at every level in an organization need to be skillful at creating resonance if that organization is to control its own destiny." And I love that concept of resonance. If we want to make our messages work for people, if we want to move ideas forward and make change in the business in our workplaces today, we have to be able to resonate with our audiences. A second thought comes from Marty Kusanmaki, founder of Jobland. He says, quote, "Especially in leadership and management, the drivers, which are now expanding to the whole workforce, are the team skills. And one of the most vital parts of that is communication skills. Communication skills is becoming a buzzword. You basically have to have it now. In the workplace, we have to be really good communicators." So let's talk about a few things. Studies show, first of all, number 1 there on the left, communication is the most commonly required skill in posted job opportunities on LinkedIn. Second, 7 of the top 20 out of more than 16,000 online training courses reviewed were directly about communication skills. You think of even the course that you're in today, it is a course about communication. 7 of the top 20, more than 16,000, were about communication skills. 92% here of hiring professionals say soft skills are just as important as hard skills. So no matter what your technical abilities are, your education, your background experience, at the end of the day, your communication skills are going to be just as important as all that technical knowledge and skills. And then 35%, effective communication skills was requested 35 times more frequently than any other soft skill. Again, communication really kind of overpowers the way we think about what's expected in terms of our skills and ability in the workplace today. So how do we prepare for communication in the workplace today? Well, I want to talk about 3 primary areas. First of all, we should view communication at work as a multicultural endeavor that embraces both diversity and inclusion. So you probably recognize in your own work, your businesses are global and multicultural. Diversity is embraced and expected. That wasn't necessarily the case, not even that long ago, but today, most businesses and just kind of the world and the culture of our workplace environments today, we expect diversity, um, and we embrace that. We also learn to listen. We must learn to listen to and understand people in new ways. We have to recognize that not everybody does things the same way that we do, that different cultures, different backgrounds, different types of abilities will change the way people communicate. We have to be able to listen to, and to learn from others. A few thoughts and statistics about this. First of all, globally, approximately 80 million people work for foreign-owned businesses. That's a large number of people throughout the world. Large U.S.-based companies like Kellogg Company and Fresh Delonte have workforces where 60 to 80% of employees live overseas. So we're seeing large companies where the majority of their employees live in different countries. Global interest in increasing ethnic minority representation on executive teams is steadily increasing. From only 7% in 2014 to 13% in 2019, we're seeing that continue to grow today, which is a great thing. But we're seeing a lot of different diverse representation in leadership roles across the world. And companies in the top quartile for ethnic and cultural diversity are 36% more profitable than those that are not. So companies that are embracing this are really doing better financially as well. So we're going to see this more and more, and you're probably already seeing a lot of this. But first of all, we need to embrace diversity and inclusion when we're thinking about communication. Second, business communication technologies and processes are constantly evolving. We must be willing and able to evolve and adapt. Whereas in the past, we could pretty much plan on the way we communicated in the workplace. Maybe it was through email, maybe it was through in-person meetings. That has largely changed, and we're seeing a huge range of communication technologies that are constantly changing. So how we communicate today will not be how we communicate tomorrow. You need to be able to embrace that and accept that. The second thing is the tools, apps, and processes will emerge and die, sometimes at rapid paces. It's likely that your company will embrace a new technology, a new app or platform. You'll use it for a year or two, and then they'll change to the next thing. We're constantly trying to find the most effective tool, and that means our communication tools are constantly changing. We have to be willing to adapt to that. You'll see this last thing here: remote, globalized, and artificial intelligence enhanced work will be how we connect in the future. And again, just be willing to accept that and understand that communication is evolving as we embrace these new technologies. Okay, and the third thing I just want to mention is that we must become much more visually savvy. Business communication isn't just about written and spoken words anymore. We're expected to know how to do all kinds of things. Visual include designing data to look professional, interesting, and understandable. We're expected to create professional slide decks, but also other types of documents that we're sending out to clients, customers, and employees. We're expected to format reader-centered reports. Just large bodies of text aren't usually helpful enough in today's visually centric world. So we need to make sure that we're formatting reader-centered reports. We also need to even create visually structured emails. As the average office employee gets around 50 to 100 emails a day, depending on their job and profession. That means we have to find ways to simplify, reduce, and help people visually connect to the information, which means using bolded lists, and color and some of the other things that we can integrate, highlighting techniques into our emails as well. So 3 primary things we're seeing change in businesses today. Essentially, we need to draw attention, cut through clutter, and make our key points quicker and easier to understand in today's workplace environment. Okay, but despite the many changes in workplace communication, one thing is constant. We are communicating to people, to human beings, people who have needs. We're trying to get our messages clear to them so that they can act upon those messages. That means that we need to be thinking from a user-centered and inclusive mindset at all times. If we want to get our messages to really resonate with people, we have to be thinking from those 2 perspectives, user-centered and inclusive. That means we need to know and understand our audience. We need to listen to and respond to their needs. We need to be conscious about our approach and our communication means. And we need to communicate with empathy and inclusion. So let's talk about those two terms real quick. Next, we need to learn from our mistakes and keep improving. So before we move into the next phase, let's quickly discuss what it means to be empathetic and inclusive, because all good communication starts with those two concepts. All right, so empathetic and inclusive. First of all, there on the left, empathetic means having the ability to understand how someone is feeling, making concerted efforts to be aware of and sensitive to what someone else is experiencing. And so as we communicate with people, whether that's verbally or through a PowerPoint presentation or through a document or an email that we're sending, we have to be empathetic to their needs. What are they thinking and feeling in this moment? How are they receiving this message? How can we be empathetic to their experience, to their background, to their culture, to their knowledge level, to their mood, to their physical situation, whatever it might be? How can we be empathetic to those needs? And then inclusive is a related concept, but it's making people with all varieties of differences and abilities feel valued and included for their contributions, while providing the same opportunities for people with disabilities, the same opportunities for people with disabilities as their coworkers to advance. So making sure that all people are able to contribute and feel valued for their contributions, regardless of what their ability might be or their disability might be. Okay, so we're going to finish out this segment talking about what it means to be an inclusive communicator. To do that, you must, first of all, be aware of yourself. Be aware of your own biases, experiences, and backgrounds, recognizing how they shape the way you think, speak, and act. We will talk about this more also in Module 2, but first of all, just be kind of aware of yourself. Second of all, adapt to your audience's needs. Know your audience's needs and adapt based on their experience, background, and ability. We need to be using inclusive language. And again, we'll talk about this more in Module 2, but some just kind of key things to remember. Avoid gendered language. Respect preferred pronouns, what individuals prefer to be called by. We need to respect those. Avoid age-based language, saying things like fresh out of college or elderly employees does label people in ways that aren't necessarily helpful in the workplace. When referring to disability, don't use negative implications. We don't want to say things like suffered from or afflicted by. Rather, we want to use person-first language, a person with a disability rather than a disabled person. So be thinking about person-first language that always positions people in the most positive way. We need to embrace neurodivergence. This is this idea that there's a large majority or a large percentage of the population that responds to communication differently than what we traditionally consider common or normal. But we look at a variety of different ways in which people understand and communicate with people. You'll see 1 in 7 people are estimated to be neurodivergent, meaning that these are individuals with maybe autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette syndrome, OCD, or epilepsy, or related areas. So 1 in 7 people, it's a lot of people that we need to find ways to communicate effectively to. So view as a difference to be supported rather than an impairment. We need to be seeing these as opportunities to really include everybody. Break instructions into chunks. These are good best practices for all people, whether they're neurodivergent or not. Breaking instructions into chunks is helpful for people. Don't expect small talk out of people. A lot of times we in the workplace have certain cultural expectations about the way people interact with us. If someone doesn't engage in small talk, that doesn't make them unfriendly, it doesn't make them incompetent. Rather, it just makes them communicate a little bit differently. So don't necessarily expect that small talk from all people. Be specific, and again, this is important for all people. But avoid ambiguous terms like later or soon. Give definitive timeframes and deadlines. Avoid metaphor, sarcasm, or idiom, especially when you know when someone is neurodivergent. These concepts can sometimes be hard to understand, and they aren't as clear. There's a lot of ambiguity built into those types of phrases. Also, adjust your own expectations. Sometimes handshakes and eye contact may be inconsistent from some people. Don't be offended, alarmed by or annoyed when somebody doesn't necessarily interact with you in the way in which you expect. So again, embrace a wide variety of ways in which people communicate. And then use visuals to reinforce information. Sometimes that can really help draw some clarity between complex ideas. And then make your written text dyslexia friendly, meaning you're using fonts that are easy to read, you're spacing out your text and things like that. Okay, also to be an inclusive communicator, you want to consider a few different things. For recruitment, for example, you can consider the accessibility of your documentation. Can all people access this information um, uh, in a way that is conducive to their environment, to their learning ability, or their capabilities? Um, Also, alternatives to traditional interviews might be a good opportunity or option. So you can create videos or pre-recorded presentations and so forth. For meetings, you might consider allowing remote or in-person attendance, thinking about the way in which people have the ability to get into your workplace environment. Allow questions to be submitted in multiple formats. You might allow people to ask questions in person live during the meeting, but also maybe open up a chat where people can ask questions in a chat feature or even submit questions in advance of the meeting. So there's a variety of different ways in which people can interact and engage with and put their perspectives into the meeting. Make sure the location is accessible. Consider things like visual, auditory, and physical space and how that will impact all members of your team and employees. When you're delivering presentations, also consider things like including live captions or having an interpreter present, and then also recording for later listening. And then also you can consider providing written scripts for those maybe who weren't in attendance or who might need to be able to slow down and read the material at a later time. All right, so those are some of the big concepts you want to be thinking about in terms of business communication today and how it is evolving. We're going to now move into the next segment, Module 1.2, how the communication process works. Okay, Module 1.2, how communication works. In this segment, we're going to walk through what the communication process looks like, what noise is, and how to work on reducing noise in the communication process. All right, so how does communication work? Well, let's start with a couple of simple stories to explain the process. So story number one is what I call the shopping list. You can see Jasmine and Kevin there on the left preparing for an office party. In this case, Jasmine's preparing for a party they're going to be holding at their office that night. Kevin is actually preparing to meet with a client in about an hour. Well, Jasmine is in a hurry and realizes she's not going to have enough time to get everything done unless she can get some help. She realizes that Kevin has about an hour before he's meeting with his client, so she says, "Hey, Kevin, is there any way you can run to the store and get a few items for our office party tonight before you meet with your client?" Kevin says, "Sure, I would love to help. If you don't mind, though, just write me a quick list so that I can get to the store and back before I meet with my client." So Jasmine hurries and puts together a quick list, writes down 7 items, gives it to Kevin, and he runs out the door. Well, Kevin is gone longer than Jasmine expects. In fact, he's gone long enough that she starts to get concerned because she knew that he was in a hurry to get back and meet with his client. Well, right as she's about to call to see where he's at, Kevin comes running through the door, drops off 2 bags of groceries from her shopping list on the table, and runs back out to the car to get another load. Well, she's a little confused. She's thinking, I just bought 7 small items. I'm not really sure what he bought. So she starts looking through the first bag and sees an ice cream scoop. And she says, okay, good. I asked for that. And she looks in the second bag and finds 2 cake knives. And she's thinking, okay, well, I did ask for a cake knife, but I only needed 1, not 2. Well, Kevin runs back with 3 more bags, drops them off on the table, and says he'll be back for another load. Well, now she's even more confused. She's thinking, what on earth did he buy? And she looks in the third bag and finds 3 bags of balloons. And in the fourth bag, there's 4 boxes of forks. And in the fifth bag, there's 5 packages of plates. And she's thinking, I asked for all of these things, but I only asked for 1 of each. I didn't need 3 bags of balloons and 4 boxes of forks and 5 packages of plates. Well, then she notices in that fifth bag her shopping list that she had handed to Kevin. And she starts to look at it and she starts to see what happened. And you can see on this list here on the screen how she wrote that list out to Kevin with those numbers. Well, as she's starting to realize what happened, Kevin comes in a few more times with 6 gallons of orange juice and then comes in 3 or 4 more times bringing in 7 large bags of ice. Well, this is kind of a funny story that shows a small communication breakdown here that affected the way Kevin interpreted the message and brought in a lot more than Jasmine asked for. Well, at the most basic level, you can see here what happened. Jasmine wrote numbers down and did not put a period or a full stop after each number. which then Kevin interpreted as meaning quantity. And both of them were in a hurry. And so we end up with a miscommunication. Kevin buys a lot of stuff that Jasmine doesn't need. Whenever we're communicating, we're operating in a scenario like this, and we call this the communication feedback loop. No matter what the communication is, there's always a sender. That could be an individual or it could be an organization. They're there on the left, and they're communicating to an audience, the person or group of people like stakeholders or audiences there on the right, and we call them the receiver. Inside the sender and receiver, there's a few things happening. First of all, the sender encodes the message. They determine what words they're going to say, what numbers, letters, grammar, punctuation, tone. They put a lot of these things. They might put some visuals in there. That's how they're encoding the message. And then the receiver there on the right gets the message and they decode that. They interpret what these symbols and signs mean, what these language words, periods and things mean, and visuals. The medium is just the channel in which we send it. So that could be a piece of paper, it could be a one-on-one verbal conversation, it could be in a presentation, it could be a radio advertisement or anything else. The feedback then is what happens when the sender realizes whether or not the receiver understood the message in the way that they intended. If they intended it the way they expected, then it's positive feedback. If the person interpreted the message differently, then it might be negative or no feedback at all. So in the case of well, actually, if you see those diagonal lines there in between, this is kind of the critical part. In between each of these areas of the communication feedback loop, there's what's called noise. These are interferences, things that get in the way of interpreting a message, things that impede someone's ability to understand the message in the way that you intended them to. And noise looks like a lot of different things in a lot of different scenarios. We're going to break that down in just a minute. The goal in this communication feedback loop is always to find ways to reduce the amount of noise so that when you send a message, the receiver will interpret it the way that you meant. Reduce the noise is always the key component here. So in the case of Kevin and Jasmine here, well, let's kind of break down what this looks like. Jasmine's the sender. She writes out a list. That's her communication. She sends a message. She encodes that message by writing it with numbers and no period. So she writes down all the things that she needs, and she puts numbers there on the left with no period. The medium is just, in this case, a piece of paper. She hands it to Kevin. Okay, so the receiver, Kevin then receives the message from Jasmine, and he decodes this message. He interprets what she means. He looks at those numbers. His background experience, his life experience has taught him that numbers with no periods means quantity, and therefore he should be buying that number of things. Okay, in all of this, there's and then the feedback, of course, is when Kevin shows up with different items than Jasmine expected, and she realizes that the communication didn't work the way she expected. Okay, so in all this, there's a variety of different things that we could label as noise, but what I would say is the two primary things that get in the way are, first of all, time. They're both in a hurry. Jasmine's in a hurry. She writes the list quickly, doesn't necessarily think real clearly about the way she's encoding the message. And then Kevin, as he's decoding the message, just assumes quantity and does not take the time to call Jasmine. He quickly gathers everything on the list, and there's just kind of that lack of communication. We call that the noise that gets in the way. You could say there's some other types of noise there, but those are probably the two primary things that get in the way there. And that second one there, the numbers with lack of periods, is kind of it's both a kind of a cultural noise from Kevin's background experience, and also a semantic noise where we're looking at periods and numbers themselves. All right, so that's one quick example of the communication feedback loop. Let me go ahead and share a second story just to kind of reinforce this idea. This is a story it's a true story of a man named Barry Marshall. I call it the brash scientist because, unfortunately, after an incident, he was labeled as kind of a mad scientist or a brash scientist amongst some in his scientific community. Well, when he was a young researcher in the 1980s, this was around 1983, 1984, Barry Marshall was doing some clinical trials. He was studying the field of gastroenterology. Now, at the time in the field of gastroenterology, it was widely believed that stomach ulcers were largely caused by psychological factors, things like anxiety or stress, and you could not treat them with some kind of an antibiotic. This was the prevailing thought in the field. Well, in this clinic that Barry Marshall was doing his research in, he discovered that most of his patients that came in with stomach ulcer symptoms had a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori, or H. pylori. This was a huge discovery. This meant that if that truly was what was causing stomach ulcers, then it could be treated with some kind of a medication. some sort of antibacterial medication. So this was a huge discovery for the field of gastroenterology, first off, also a huge discovery for the pharmaceutical field, who could develop medications directly for stomach ulcer type symptoms, but also a huge discovery for patients who had these types of symptoms. So Barry Marshall's very, very excited about this. And he goes to an international conference where he's presenting to scientists and medical professionals in gastroenterology, presenting his clinical trials and his research. He was very confident about this, overly excited. And again, remember, he was a new researcher, young in the field. And in the middle of his presentation, he makes this comment. He says, quote, H. pylori, or Helicobacter pylori, is the cause of all stomach ulcer disease, and chronic ulcer recurrence can be eradicated in all patients. Well, this statement didn't set well with his audience. You can see in that statement he used what we often refer to as absolute language. He says all stomach ulcer disease can be eradicated in all patients. Using these terms showed to his scientific community that he was a little bit naive. He was using terms that weren't oftenly used in science and in medicine when we're doing research. Well, they were intrigued by his research, but quickly brushed him off as being a little bit naive and overconfident. Well, Marshall was so bothered by this that they didn't embrace his message that he went back to his clinic and decided he was going to prove the community wrong. And he created a petri dish full of this bacteria, Helicobacter pylori, and drank it and made himself really, really sick and gave himself some serious stomach ulcers. Then he took some medication and healed himself through this. And he assumed that that was going to convince the scientific community that he was right. Well, unfortunately, this actually made things worse, as you might imagine. Those in the scientific community saw him as being dangerous and a crazy and mad scientist and doing things that were totally unacceptable and outside of the realm of what's considered common and normal in his field. And they didn't really embrace his research for at least another 10 years. The sad thing about this entire story, though, is that Barry Marshall was mostly right, that this bacteria did in fact cause stomach ulcers, and you could treat many of them with some kind of medication. Unfortunately, though, it took the field so long for him to embrace his research that he didn't get recognized for this for almost 20 years later. He did eventually win a Nobel Prize in medicine, but the delay of the scientific community to embrace his message because of the way he communicated it was unfortunate. So again, thinking about the communication feedback loop, let's kind of look at what this looked like in this particular situation. So the sender, Barry Marshall, is the sender. He's presenting his work to medical and scientific experts. He's sending that message. He encodes the message using things like absolute language and a confident tone to shape his message. He chooses the way in which he presents it. The medium in this case is just a presentation at a conference. He's in front of a group of people there at this conference. Well, the receivers are the medical and scientific community in gastroenterology, those that are in attendance at the presentation, and also others who are interested in doing research in this field. And then decoding. The attendees find Marshall's approach to be naive, brash, arrogant, and then dangerous as he moves into other more extreme measures of making his point. But they interpret him as being unaware, too brash, overconfident. They didn't really embrace his research there. So then the feedback, of course, is when the community doesn't embrace Marshall's work for over a decade. And that's how Marshall gets the feedback from his particular approach to communication. In this case, you might say the noise would be, of course, absolute language. The language itself that he used made him look a little bit naive to this particular community. His brash tone. The scientist's background. They expected science to be done in a certain way and talked about in a certain way. He didn't follow those particular protocol. And then also his unconventional approach to research, the way that he drank the petri dish of that bacteria and so forth. And so all those things got in the way of his message being understood, even though his research was in fact mostly accurate and he had a lot of good things to contribute to the community. All of this noise got in the way of his message. All right, so if you think about those two stories in general, this is how communication works regardless of who our senders and receivers are. Again, whether it's an individual or a business, or and the receivers are an individual or a large audience. There's all these things happening. We've got the sender, the encoding, the medium, the decoding, the receiver, and the feedback, and then all these elements of noise. Well, we usually break noise down into 7 different areas. So what we're going to do now for the next few minutes is break down what each of these different types of noise are, talk about some strategies for overcoming those noise, and then we'll kind of finish off by talking about some big overarching ways in which we can reduce noise in the workplace so that we can communicate with the best positive kind of feedback that we're looking for. All right, so what is physical noise? Physical is what it sounds like. It's actual physical noise. Any auditory sound that gets in the way of understanding. So some examples might be if there's construction outside, or there's a phone ringing in the background, or music playing, or traffic, or maybe someone tapping on their desk, or anything else that's going to be physical noise that might get in the way of someone understanding or hearing the message that you need. So how do you overcome physical noise? Well, first of all, you just identify what the source of noise is, reduce it or turn it off, and then move maybe to a quieter location if possible. That seems to be the most common and easy way to fix physical noise. All right, let's talk about semantic noise. So semantic noise is misunderstanding in words, grammar, languages, symbols, and signs. So these are things like if you're speaking to someone who has a different native language than your own, and you're using words maybe that they don't understand, or perhaps your grammar or punctuation doesn't quite work. So some examples here, you'll see a misunderstood punctuation, as was the case, for example, in that grocery list, the missing period, or translation errors, misunderstanding of a term, misinterpretation of a metaphor or idiom or something like that. Using the wrong word, just saying the wrong thing that might create some confusion later. Technical jargon or an acronym that is unknown. So if you're using acronyms or terms or phrases that someone in your audience doesn't understand, that can also create that semantic type noise. So how do you overcome semantic noise? Well, first of all, know your audience, know their background, know their experience with the language, understand their grammar and things like that. Use simple language. We'll talk about this again more in simple language we'll talk about in Module 3, but also reducing technical terms and acronyms that your audience will not understand. So try to reduce your semantic noise. All right, physiological noise. Okay, physiological noise is a physical ability or health that interferes with hearing, understanding, or paying attention to a message. So some examples of physiological noise would be things like maybe hearing or vision limitations, headaches, fatigue, the temperature in a room. If someone feels really uncomfortable, they might have a hard time paying attention. If someone is speaking really fast, that could also be considered physiological noise. If you think, oh, I've got this headache, I can't listen, I can't concentrate, that could be an example of physiological noise. So how do you reduce physiological noise? Well, make communications accessible to people of all abilities. So make sure that they can hear it, that they can read it, that they can see it. Consider visualizing content, especially for complex ideas. You can visualize that, and that will help reduce some of the physiological noise. You don't have to necessarily hear it or read it. You can just visualize it. Creating different modes and timing for messages. Think of sometimes we give one message in multiple channels. So if you give a presentation to a live audience, you might also create a manuscript, some handouts, some visuals and stuff that go hand in hand with that. So you're communicating in multiple modes there. Okay, so that's physiological noise. Then there's what's called psychological noise. Psychological noise are things like attitudes, assumptions, biases, worldviews, and individual backgrounds that interfere with interpretation of a message. Okay, so this is the way people think, the way they see the world, the way that they've been raised, their background, their culture, their ethnicity, race, religion, things like that are going to sometimes impede their ability to understand or to interpret a message. So some examples, generational language, someone that is young using terms to someone who is older, and they're not using the same terms, the same terminology. So there's a generational gap or divide there. Gendered terms. Sometimes if you say a term like, for example, stewardess, which kind of has a gendered relationship and is pointing directly to women, rather than saying flight attendant, or saying businessmen, which points to men rather than all business people, salesman instead of salespeople or salesperson. So those are gendered terms that can sometimes alienate or marginalize people in the room. If someone in the room, for example, identifies as a woman, but you're talking about the salesman, they may not be able to feel like they're related. They don't identify as a salesman, and they identify as a salesperson or a saleswoman. And so now they're being marginalized. So we have to be careful of those things. Psychological noise can get in their way of really engaging in the conversation. Or other things like religious views or political affiliations. All those types of things can get in this way of understanding, and it can create blocks in listening. So how do you overcome that? Well, first of all, include or use inclusive language, which again, we'll talk about more later in modules 2 and 3. But respect others' differences. And then also listen to perspectives and concerns, and recognize that the way you see the world isn't necessarily the way that they see the world. So we need to get on the same page and help work through that psychological noise by listening and adapting. Then there's cultural noise, which of course is related to psychological noise, but cultural noise is a misinterpretation of someone's action or behaviors based on their cultural upbringing. Sometimes people have certain backgrounds that affect the way that they communicate. It's just different than the way that you grew up learning. So some examples for might be being offended when someone of a different culture doesn't shake your hand. You might expect someone to shake your hand. They don't shake it back, and you're offended by that. Well, maybe in their culture, they don't shake hands to say hello or to say thank you or things like that. So don't be offended by that. Being offended by that is what we would call cultural noise. Not understanding a particular hand gesture. Maybe someone says something with their hands that doesn't make any sense, or maybe that gesture seems offensive to you. Or having a different understanding of work ethic or approach. Maybe you come from a culture where being very punctual is expected, and another culture says that we should be able to be a lot more flexible in our workday, and there's a misunderstanding there in cultural noise. All right, so how do you overcome cultural noise? Well, getting to know people of other cultures, learning from them, respecting differences, and just avoiding ethnocentrisms. In other words, avoiding feeling like your culture and your way of doing things is the best way of doing things. Learn from others. But I find to overcome cultural noise, it helps to just be around people that are from different cultures, travel, see and work with people from different places and backgrounds, and you become more adaptive to these different types of cultures. Okay, then there's technological noise. And as you might imagine, this is issues or access to software or hardware that interferes with a person's ability to see, hear, or receive a message. And this is when the technology doesn't quite work right, or someone doesn't have access to the appropriate technology to get the message. Some examples might be if the technology doesn't quite work right as you would expect. So how do you overcome this? Is to use technology that all have access to, making technology accessible, and testing all of the equipment. Okay, and the last one is organizational noise. Okay, organizational noise is it's a misunderstanding or ignoring of a company's established communication protocol or chain of command. So some examples would be complex organizational structure makes it difficult to know where to get answers. Maybe a vague understanding of roles affects knowing who to ask certain questions. If it's not clear what your role is in comparison to someone else's role, you may not know who to ask questions to. Questions may get lost in the process there. Or other issues with trust or leadership that impede a clear exchange of information. All these might be considered organizational noise, just the way things work within a company. So how do you overcome organizational noise? Well, clarify roles, simplify organizational structure, train employees in terms of how they access information, who they ask certain types of questions to, and then also just follow the established procedures and make sure that you're doing what your company always does so that it's clear to everybody what you are doing. So those are the 7 types of organizational noise. As we conclude this particular segment, let's just talk about a few general strategies for overcoming noise in the workplace. First of all, expect noise. Noise is going to happen. It's common and it's not entirely avoidable. Look for it, then identify it, and then improve your communication based on what you learn. So look for the different noises that are happening in your communications. If the feedback that you're getting is not what you expect, then there's noise in the way. So then identify the noise and see if you can improve upon your communication to reduce the noise. Second, just take responsibility. Don't blame others when they misunderstand you. Rather, seek to better meet their needs through improved messaging. Sometimes we get frustrated if people don't read our email. or if they don't do something the way that we ask them to. Rather than blaming them, look at the way we communicate and say, hey, maybe my email was hard to understand. Maybe I could have reframed this message. Maybe I could have said this in a different way. So take ownership of our own communication rather than blaming others. Third, tailor your messages. Recognize that different people and different audiences in different times and in different settings require different approaches to communication. Sometimes, yes, that requires more work. It requires more practice. It requires more creation of different, communication deliverables. But we're trying to reach a variety of people, so we need to understand their different needs. Also, fourth, use alternative approaches. People tend to understand concepts better with things like stories, examples, and visual representation. So find new ways to reach your audiences. If they're not really connecting with your presentations, maybe there's a different way to do your presentations. If they're not really reading your emails, maybe we can do something different than an email altogether. Maybe if it's just a lot of facts and figures, you can tell stories instead, or draw pictures, or use data visualizations. So be thinking about different approaches that might reduce the noise in that situation. Okay, a couple more. Fifth, request responses. Don't just send messages and hope for a response, but request a follow-up with a specific date or time. So when you send out messages that need a response, ask people to directly respond. In other words, don't just assume that they are going to respond. People often don't recognize that you're expecting a response unless you tell them you're expecting a response. So just include that in the way that you communicate. And then sixth, get feedback. If your messages just aren't working, ask your coworkers, your colleagues, those that you communicate to, what you can do differently. If it's just not working and you can't figure out how to reduce it, ask. Say, hey, is there a better way to do this? What would be better for you? How can I help you out so that this is going to work better for you in the future? All right, so we've talked about how the communication process works, what noise is, and how to kind of reduce noise. We've got, one seventh one here. Listen, observe, and learn. Learn to and listen to noise and notice how others communicate. Learn from others' differences and from other cultures, backgrounds, and levels of expertise. Be curious, keep learning, and adjust as you do. Okay, so those are the different types of ways to think about noise and how to reduce noise. Let's go ahead and move on to the next segment, Module 1.3, where we'll talk about reaching your audience, persuading, and providing ethical information. Okay, Module 1.3, Audience Persuasion and Ethical Information. In this segment, we're going to talk about how to persuade audiences in ways that will get them to engage with and act upon our message, but in doing it in a way that is ethical rather than manipulative. So let's go ahead and walk through what this looks like. I want to compare being persuasive to creating a garbage goat. So this is a statue, if you look at this here on the screen, of a goat that was created by artist Paula Turnbull. She created this in the 1970s in the state of Washington in the United States. She was part of the World's Fair, and she was tasked with encouraging people to throw away their garbage and keep the park clean. This is what she was asked to do. Now, a lot of ideas came across her mind. She thought I could create some posters, help encourage people to keep the park clean. She could send out messages to all the participants. She could also design garbage cans in a way that was more interesting and insightful. But one of the ideas she came up with was this: why not create a garbage can that looks like a goat and then put a powerful vacuum inside the garbage that would suck up people's garbage? In other words, make it fun to throw away your garbage. Well, this was an incredibly successful campaign. All she had to do is put the statue there, no other words or messages. It was just this statue, and people were intrigued by it. In fact, they were so persuaded by it, they started looking for garbage that they could find and put underneath the goat's mouth that it would suck up into this powerful vacuum. Well, this has been so successful that this garbage goat still exists today, over 50 years later. It's still in that same park, and it still works. They maintain this, and it still sucks up garbage, and people keep that park very clean as they've been persuaded to use this goat to throw away their garbage. Well, I like to use that comparison to the way we create communications today. Can we take a message that would otherwise maybe be ignored, or that people would not engage with, or find a reason to act upon it, and turn it into something more interesting and engaging, much like this goat? No matter what our message is, who our audience includes, or what the circumstances are, we typically need our audience to do three things. First of all, They need to notice our message. Second, they need to engage with the content. And then third, they need to act upon the message. This, of course, is a persuasive process, getting them to notice, engage, and then act. To do that, we really want to be thinking in terms of this idea of a garbage goat, though. Can we make it more interesting, more engaging, and more worthy of acting upon than it might otherwise be? Can we turn our message into that garbage goat? Well, we want to maybe think of it in another way. It's a lot like selling shoes to somebody. When we create a message, we're trying to get them to pay attention to and then eventually purchase the shoes. So with shoes, you're going to grab attention, place the shoes where they need to be noticed in a visible location. You need to design the shoes in a way that people will want to wear them. They have to feel comfortable. They have to be a good material. They may have to be the right quality or the right style, so that people are emotionally connected to this pair of shoes. And then third, we need to provide enough logical reasons for them to actually purchase and wear the shoes. So we have to set a price that's going to make sense for them. We need to make it encourage them to wear a style that maybe their friends or peers are wearing, so it feels logically enough. We give them enough logical reasons that they want to purchase those shoes. Well, a message is similar to that. When we create a message, we also have to grab their attention. We have to put it in the right channel at the right place, the right time, in a medium that is used and accessible, something that they can actually see and access this message. Then we have to create it, much like with a shoe, where you're creating the different style and the different materials and the textures and the comfort level. Same thing with our message. We have to create our message with words, grammar, structure, tone, positioning, organizational structure, visual, sound, usability, experience. There's a lot of different things that we put inside of our message that makes them connect with this, understand it, feel like it's valuable in their lives. And then third, we have to make it relevant, important, useful, and applicable. We have to find a way to make it useful to them in their lives. Otherwise, they're not going to engage with it. All right, so another way to think about this too is what we call the triune brain. It's helpful to think about how our audience's brains interpret communication in three phases: the gut, the heart, and the head. So this triune brain was a concept that was developed by neuroscientist Paul MacLean in the 1960s. It's not a perfect model of how our brain actually works, but it does help us think about how people pay attention to information in three distinct phases. We think about both the garbage goat and selling a pair of shoes. It's a lot same process. First of all, our audience, their brain is triggered by what's called the reptilian brain, or the gut, kind of that instinctual reaction. It's our initial response. It's instinctual. We either engage it or we ignore it. So we send an email to our audience. They might look at it and delete, or they might open it. They might see it or they don't see it. We put a poster on the wall. Do they see it? Do they not see it? We're giving a presentation. Are they going to show up or are they going to not show up? That is kind of that part of that reptilian brain that first of all is triggered. It grabs their attention. The second part of the brain then is the limbic, or sometimes we call it the heart. It's our emotional response. Is it intriguing enough to stay with it, to pay attention? Do we like it or do we dislike it? If we like it, then we stick with it a little bit longer. And then the third part is what we call the neocortex, or the head. This is the logical side of us. If we like it enough to pay attention to it, and then we can make logical connections between this message and our personal lives, then we're going to likely do something with it. So if you think in terms of these phases, whether you're thinking about the garbage go, where they have to pay attention to it, be persuaded by it, or the shoes, or the triune brain, it's kind of this three-part process to really get people persuaded enough to see it, like it, and then do something with it. When we communicate, our audiences have that initial gut reaction. If the communication grabs their attention, they'll begin to decide if it's worth their time. That's the limbic part of it. And then once engaged, they'll then determine what to do with it or how to use it. Thinking further with this triune model, you want to ask yourself a few questions every time you create a communication. First of all, the reptilian brain. How will my audience react when they see this? Will this grab their attention or will they ignore it? And then third, how can I make them pay attention to this with all the other information they're being exposed to? How can I cut through the clutter? And again, in business communication, we often think about email. It's one of the most common things that we send out. Well, if you're sending out an email and your audience is receiving 30, 40, 50, 100 emails a day, what can you do? Change the subject line, reduce the amount of text, add a photo. What can you do to really grab their attention? Then you ask yourself some questions for that limbic part of the brain, the emotional side. How will this message make them feel? Do they feel like they're learning something? Are they getting what they want out of the message? Does it make them excited or motivated, or does it make them feel like they're frustrated, or does it kind of leave them feeling wanting something? Does it resonate with their personality, experience, knowledge level, preference, culture, or background? Are we making sure we're being inclusive? And some of those things we talked about in the previous segments. Is my message simple, accessible, and interesting enough to keep them engaged and wanting more? Are we really giving them exactly what they need, no more, no less? That's kind of what we're thinking there with the limbic brain. And then the neocortex is this: am I giving them all the necessary information that they need to make that decision? Do they feel like they have enough information that they can logically move forward with what they have? Or are they still wondering if they have enough? Is the message clear, unambiguous, and helpful? And then lastly, does my message encourage them to act? Or is there something that might discourage them to act? Is there something that was said or something that might be less credible or something like that that would lead them away from doing something? All right, so I'm going to give you yet another way of thinking about persuading. This comes from Greek philosopher Aristotle. He once developed what's called the rhetorical triangle. In other words, as we try to persuade people, we do that through three methods, and this is very similar to the triune brain. The idea, first of all, it's ethos. We have to build credibility within our communications, whether that's a face-to-face conversation, if it's in an email, if it's in a presentation, if it's in a report. People have to be able to trust us and trust our information, otherwise they check out. So how do we do that? Well, it's through language, it's through research, it's through the different things that might lend credibility to our message. Then we have to reach them through emotions. Now, some messages will lean more towards credibility, some will lean more towards emotion, some will lean more towards logic, but we're trying to persuade them. And that pathos or that emotional reaction, again, that's that connection. And then again, logos is the logic. So they need to be able to make enough logical connection between the message and what they need and how they apply it in their lives to make it useful to them. And so you see this thought here on the right. Whenever we communicate, we make rhetorical choices about our words, tone, channel, and so forth. Those choices affect how our audiences interpret or decode and are persuaded by our message. What can we include in our available means of persuasion? And you see, that's what Aristotle's thought is. Rhetoric is the faculty of observing, in any case, the available means of persuasion. So we make a lot of choices when we create message about what we're going to include and not include. And those choices affect our credibility, the emotional response of our audience, and whether or not they're able to make logical connections. So what are our available means when we communicate? Well, they're really any method through which we communicate. So when we think of language, that might be the words we choose. Diction could be our grammatical choices, punctuation, structure, metaphor, stories, giving examples. Or it could be the tone of voice in which we share it. So it could be humorous, or it could be professional, or serious, or reserved, or angry, or conventional, or anything else. But our tone is another rhetorical means, our available means. We can choose to put visuals in our messages. We can adjust the layouts, the heading, maybe the highlighting techniques, the position of things, the way they're placed, images, charts, colors, icons, doodles, anything we might include in our message that can, again, persuade and help people to get on board with the message. Sounds, other channels, and things like that. When we talk about our available means of persuasion, there is so much at our disposal. We have to be strategic and conscious about what we're including in those messages. Again, thinking with the triune brain in mind, thinking with the rhetorical triangle in mind, and thinking about turning it into a garbage goat or selling shoes. So these are all these concepts I'm laying out here to say there are a lot of ways to think about how we persuade our audiences. We just have to be strategic and conscious about those choices. To persuade, we must be conscious of three things that shape then our use of our available means. We have to understand the rhetorical situation, which is that context in which we're communicating, the timing of our message, our audience, what they know and don't know, what they need to know. We need to be thinking about our purpose, the need and reason for the communication. Every nuance in purpose changes how the message should be created. If there's even a slight variation in the way our audience is or the circumstances that surround our message, we need to tweak and adjust that message. And then third, exigence. This is the urgency in which the communication matters, or the extent to which it will impact our intended audiences. If we understand these three things, then we can use our rhetorical means of persuasion, our variety of different choices to then navigate the complexity of persuading our audience. Then we also need to seek their individual and collective needs. Okay, so you've probably heard of this. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is a long and well-recognized principle of psychology that says all human beings have basic needs. At the most basic level, we have physiological needs. We need food and water to live. After we have food and water, we then need safety. We need shelter, something to protect us from the elements and from danger. We have social needs then. Once our safety needs are met, so we move up the hierarchy, we have needs of having friends and connections with people. And then after that, we have those connections and friends. Then we need to have self-esteem needs. We need to feel good about ourselves. And then lastly is that self-actualization. That's the highest pinnacle of our hierarchy. If we can get up there, it's this idea of spirituality and fulfillment, where we're doing things that make us feel good, that make us extra happy. So this is the hierarchy of needs, and we can kind of move up that level to be the happiest forms of human beings we can be. We try to reach that top pinnacle area. You can see here, as human beings, we all have hierarchical needs, increasing towards a more fulfilling life. Now, I like to develop this in terms of communication. We've seen a lot of different fields use the hierarchy of needs to adapt, and I like to use it in business communication as well. So if we think about reaching the pinnacle of our communication standards, we're trying to climb up that hierarchy of needs. What does our audience really genuinely need, and can we get that to be the highest level of impact? So there's 6 different levels we hear, and you can see the middle there. I have that threshold. We always want to at least get above that threshold into the convenient level. So let's look at what this means. At the most functional level, our messages need to be understandable. They need to be written in the language of the audience. They need to make sense. We need to be using terms and acronyms that our audience can relate to. The visuals need to make sense, and the technology works. So that's the most basic, and most of us can reach the functional level. When we send an email, when we have a conversation, most people at the functional level will understand our message. The next, though, is reliable. So in addition to it being understandable, it needs to be accurate. It needs to be ethical, useful. It needs to be something that our audience can rely on. It has to come from credible sources. Then it's usable. Usable means it's accessible, it's navigable, it doesn't cause confusion or frustration. In other words, not only does it work and it's reliable information, but we can apply it in our own life. It's useful to use. We understand it. There's nothing that really makes us frustrated about accessing it. So most people in most situations can reach the functional, reliable, and usable areas of communication. It's getting above the threshold that seems to be difficult. If we can at least get up above those dotted lines into the convenient level, we start creating communications that help our audience. So convenient means it's easy to access, read, and view. It's clear and simple and obvious. This means we've added in headings, maybe some visual diagrams, organizational structure that makes it simpler and easier. We might reduce excess text. We might add some color to make it more useful. And convenient and easy to understand. But then enjoyable takes us even higher up. So enjoyable really speaks to people. It's conversational. It's at their level. It's visually and organizationally attractive. So it's well designed. It looks really aesthetically pleasing. It's engaging. It's fun and nice to review and to look at. That becomes the enjoyable area. The last set is the impactful level. This is where it creates personal connections with people. It resonates with them on an individual level, and it leaves an impression. We don't always, with every message, need to create or hit that impactful level, but we should at least be convenient. Our messages should be more than functional, reliable, and usable. They should be convenient. What can we do to make it convenient? You can see here, aim to move communications past the basic use threshold into the human-centered realm. Human-centered meaning that the content will generally create a better, more memorable experience for our audience. You can make your information pleasurable and meaningful, and your content will have more and greater impact. That's what we're trying to do with this hierarchy of needs here. Okay, so just thinking about the typical day-to-day business communication like an email, can we adjust our communications to climb higher on the hierarchy, even with simple adjustments? So you look at an email like this that you might get. This email is dense. It has a lot of important information. There's a lot of data, but it's packed into one really long paragraph. It's cumbersome to read. This is functional, it is reliable, and it technically is usable. However, this is not convenient, and it's not enjoyable, and it certainly is not impactful. A lot of the important information is lost in a message that looks like this. If you redesign and simplify this, you can cross that threshold. So if you see this email, you'll notice that we've taken out a lot of excess text, put the message into a bolded list, and suddenly we can read this a lot quicker. You can see how fast this one on the right reads. I'll just read it quickly. Good morning, Kofi. I hope you're doing well. I have a few updates on the product review and a plan moving forward. First, some findings. Accessory sales are down 17%. Inflation and other distribution factors are down up 14%. You can see how this reads. We've got the data. It's easier to follow along. We've got the bold for the text to be drawn out. And then at the very end there, you see, unfortunately, the turnaround time is really tight. We need this pitch by next Friday, April 19th, and that Friday, April 19th is highlighted in red. So this becomes a lot easier, more convenient message to read. It's more enjoyable as we think through processing all of the data and the process. This is a much better document that follows that hierarchy of needs. This is a more persuasive and useful message there on the right. It's much more meaningful. Okay, so as we're thinking about persuading our audience and climbing up that hierarchy of needs, some questions to ask about our audience. Who are the people that make up my audience? What do they need? Where will they be reading, viewing, or listening to or interacting with my message? When will they be reading, viewing, or listening or interacting with my message? And why will they be reading, viewing, or listening to? And then, of course, how will they be? So it's the who, what, where, when, how process. And then you relate those similar questions to yourself and your relationship with your audience. Who am I in the larger rhetorical context of this message? What do I need my audience to know? What do I want my audience to where do I want my audience to interact with my message? When do I want my audience to interact with the message? Why do I want my audience to interact with that message? And then, of course, how do I want them to interact with that particular message? So be asking yourself those questions, and you can, as you think through the answers to those questions, that will help you get higher up on that impact hierarchy. Okay. Lastly, in this segment, I just want to talk about is we're trying to persuade people to engage with our material, though. We need to make sure that we are persuasive. And to be persuasive, we have to be ethical, meaning that we are aiming for information, not misinformation or disinformation. So information is useful, meaningful, and accurate. Misinformation is when we might make mistakes. Maybe our research is a little bit off, or our data is confusing, or it's ambiguous and hard to understand. We call that misinformation. The third level is disinformation, where we're intentionally misleading. Maybe you're trying to be, make a political statement and you're hiding behind some of the facts or information. We definitely want to avoid that, but really we want to avoid misinformation as well. When we communicate, we have a responsibility to provide useful, meaningful, and accurate information and to avoid the misinformation and disinformation. So how can we tell if our communication is manipulative or if it's simply persuasive? We want it to be persuasive, not manipulative. So we can ask ourselves the 4 P's here. First of all, ask yourself questions about people. Whose interests are being represented? Is it representing our audience, or is it just representing ourselves? Really, we want to be people-focused, our audience-focused. Are the people are being represented fairly and accurately? Next is the power dynamic. What's happening within our communication, and how does that affect the people that we are communicating to? Is my position of power exerting pressure or deception? How would someone not in a position of power be affected by this particular message. Then also ask yourself about the purpose. Is the message aiming to inform, misinform, or disinform? Because if it is, then it's going to fall into the manipulative area. We don't want that. What is the harm versus help ratio of the message? Are you helping people more than you are harming them? And then lastly, the position. Does the positioning of the message prey on someone's vulnerability? Is the timing of the message compassionate and ethical? If you think about, has something serious happened and this might not be the right time, that's when we talk about position. And then also the context. Does the context change the ethics of the message? If this would have been delivered another time or another place to another group of people, does that change the way the message is interpreted and understood? So we want to be asking ourselves those 4 questions. All right. Well, as we kind of get towards the end of this segment, remember that manipulation is something you do to an audience, applying deceptive or coercive tactics to unknowingly alter perception or force action. Persuasion, rather, is something you do with an audience, identify with another through emotion, logic, and credibility to encourage understanding and action. I love this thought from Edward Murrow. He says, to be persuasive, we must be believable. To be believable, we must be credible. To be credible, we must be truthful. Okay, that's a lot to think about in terms of audience and persuasion. But again, be thinking about the triune brain. Be thinking about selling our ideal, much like we sell shoes. Be thinking about that hierarchy of needs so that we can really reach across that threshold of communication. But then as we're doing all of this, we want to make sure that we are being persuasive, not manipulative. We want to be ethical and make sure our communication is reaching our audiences in the ways that are going to best help them. All right, so that's it for segment 1.3. Now we're going to move into 1.4, emotional intelligence and communication. We'll see you next. So we're to module 1.4, emotional intelligence and communication. This is the last segment in module 1. For this last segment, we want to talk about emotional intelligence as a way to become a better communicator. So if you're familiar with this topic, great. If not, let's go ahead and walk through a few of the things you want to know about being more emotionally intelligent. So what is this concept of emotional intelligence? Well, a few thoughts here that I have on the screen. The first one from Daniel Goleman. He is author of the really popular book that kind of popularized this concept of emotional intelligence. He says that what really matters for success, character, happiness, and lifelong achievement is a definite skill or a definite set of emotional skills, your EQ, not just purely cognitive abilities that are measured by conventional IQ tests. So your emotional intelligence is what makes you happier, more successful, and be able to achieve more. Another related thought comes from Laura Wilcox from Harvard University. She says, quote, emotional intelligence accounts for nearly 90% of what moves people up the ladder when IQ and technical skills are roughly similar. So if you have the same skills as somebody else, it's your emotional intelligence that's going to move you to that next phase to be advanced in your career. So what is this? Well, the dictionary definition of emotional intelligence is, quote, the capacity to be aware of, control, and express one's emotions, and to handle interpersonal relationships judiciously and empathetically. I like those last 2 terms there, that you understand how to make decisions about how you use your emotions, and that you recognize how your emotions affect other people and how you can interact with their emotions as well. So really the idea of emotional intelligence is being able to connect with, make relationships with people and understand how your emotional reaction and their emotional reactions affect all these interactions we have with those that we have at work and in life. So there are 5 domains of emotional intelligence, and I'll just kind of go from top around the circle here. First of all, self-awareness, and then self-regulation, social awareness, motivation, and empathy. If you can really become strong in each of these 5 areas, you're going to be a much better communicator and be able to build much stronger relationships at work and beyond. This is critically important for workplace success today, and it is directly related to communication. So we're just going to break down each of these five domains of emotional intelligence. So let's look first of all at self-awareness. Self-awareness is the ability to recognize and understand your emotions, actions, and moods, as well as the ability to recognize how those emotions affect those around you. So being aware of what your emotional state is and how that emotional state is affecting those around you. So to become self-aware, you need to be able to monitor your own thoughts, understand what it is you're thinking, and be able to change what you're thinking when you need to. Monitor your feelings. Likewise, you need to recognize how you're feeling and how that affects the way that you're acting, which then goes to the next, monitor your actions. You're kind of keeping a log of what you're doing, how you're doing it, and why you're doing it. You also need to identify and label those emotions. Recognize what it is that triggers certain types of emotions in you, what you label those, and what circumstances tend to create those types of emotions. And then also make connections between how you feel affects the way you behave and how the way you behave affects others. So it's being very self-aware, understanding what you're doing and how that affects the people around you. So to improve in self-awareness, you want to do a few things. Make connections between your thoughts, emotions, and actions. Ask others for feedback if you're wondering how you are perceived by others and how you might be able to adapt and change in certain circumstances. Sometimes it's really helpful to get other people's experiences or perspectives. Reflect on your experiences. What have you done in the past? How have you reacted, and was that the right choice or the wrong choice? And how can you maybe do something differently in the future? Track your emotions and responses in a journal. To really get better at self-awareness, you have to monitor this and track it and really understand how you're doing in each of these areas. And then also use some positive self-talk. Talk about yourself in ways that helps you see yourself in positive ways, but also that helps you improve. Don't talk about yourself negatively and put yourself down in ways that are not going to be affecting positive change. Okay, so this is the idea of self-awareness. You want to become aware of yourself and how you impact others. And of course, you can see that last one, set goals there. Okay, next is self-regulation, the ability to manage your emotions, expressing them appropriately in the right time and in the right situation. So taking responsibility for actions and being conscious of how what you do affects others. So self-regulation is very similar and of course directly related to self-awareness. But in addition to being self-aware, once you're aware of how you are and how those things affect other people, you have to be able to control then how you act. If you know you get angry in certain circumstances, if you get jealous in certain circumstances, if you get overly excited or overly nervous, we have to be able to control those emotional states. So to become self-regulated, it means to learn to be flexible and adaptive in new or unfamiliar situations, recognizing that when something goes differently than the way you expected or the way that you would have preferred, you have to be able to adapt and say, okay, I'm okay with this. I can adjust to this. So you have to learn to be flexible. Also, to diffuse rather than escalate or ignore difficult situations. If you recognize that when you're in a situation that makes you uncomfortable or unhappy, you have to learn to diffuse rather than just escalate or simply ignore. So you're working to make things get a little bit better rather than just set them aside for now or to get them to the point where they get worse. Own your own mistakes and work to improve. Recognize that you're not perfect. None of us are, or none of us is perfect. So we need to find ways to acknowledge that, acknowledge our mistakes, and then work to improve. Don't just assume that we're always right. All right, to improve self-regulation, a few tips. You want to view challenges as opportunities when difficult things happen rather than just be discouraged and frustrated and say, hey, what's the opportunity in this particular circumstance? Next, remind yourself that you choose how you respond. Others don't control the way that you respond. That is up to you. So embrace that, empower yourself and say, I can self-regulate. I can do better. I can change my reaction to this situation. Third, discover personalized methods for coping with your emotions. Recognize that your emotions and your personality is different than someone else. So, what's the personalized method for coping with your own difficult situations? That might be maybe you go exercise, maybe you go breathe or meditate, maybe you go have a drink or just go, call somebody that can help you talk through things. Whatever it is, discover your personalized methods for coping with emotions that are hard for you to manage. All right, so that's self-regulation. The third area then is social awareness, being aware of how you interact and how others interact in particular circumstances. This is the ability to build meaningful relationships with other people while recognizing others' emotions and dynamics within a situation or organization. So having the ability to really build meaningful relationships where you connect with people and understand how others relate with and interact with other people within the organization. This changes depending on power dynamics. You interact with peers probably different than you would your supervisors or the people that you supervise. So you have to be aware of all those different interactions and dynamics. So to become socially aware, you want to learn learn to interact with people in positive ways, making people feel comfortable, making yourself feel comfortable, making you be able to interact in ways that are meaningful and helpful. And of course, doesn't mean you have to be best friends with everybody, but you do have to be able to work towards end goals together. You need to be able to make decisions together. You need to be able to interact in ways that are positive and helpful. You need to be able to establish meaningful relationships with coworkers, and then also recognize how your interactions are affecting those around you. Okay, so to improve your social awareness, you want to ask open-ended questions. This is a great way. If you're not really good at being social, if you have a hard time having good conversations with people, it's helpful to ask open-ended questions. Things like, how was your weekend? What's going on with your project right now? What is it that you love about your job? Whatever those questions are, they're open-ended rather than just saying, how are you doing? Is this something you like? Those are just yes, no questions, and that's going to close off the ability to have a good, meaningful conversation with others. Practice using icebreakers and other conversation starters. Think of different ways in which you can open up a conversation and get thoughts out and talking to people. Work on making good eye contact. Eye contact is really helpful for social interactions. People tend to respond better with good eye contact, recognizing, of course, that not everybody is good at eye contact. And of course, we talked about neurodivergence in a previous module. So if that's not something that your coworkers are good at, still interact with them. Or if it's something that you yourself is not good at, it's something you can work on and attempt to engage better with people, is trying to make that eye contact when possible. Listen intently and acknowledge what others are saying. People like to feel like they're being listened to. Ask follow-up questions to what they're saying. Recognize that not every conversation is about you. The more things become about you, the more people tend to start to disconnect. So being socially aware means to really listen and understand and acknowledge what people are saying and how they feel and think. All right, so that's social awareness. Yeah, sorry, last, the know how your body language and sense of personal space also affects others. The way that you're moving might have an impact on other people. Some people really don't like to be touched at all. If you touch their shoulder and they have a real strong resistance to that, acknowledge that, be aware of that, and back off. If you're too close to them or too far away from them, if you're not talking loud enough, or if you're making some mannerisms that you can see that they're responding in ways that don't look positive, adjust and adapt to those circumstances. So that's what we're talking about with social awareness. Let's move into empathy now. This is the fourth area. Empathy is the ability to understand how others are feeling and then respond accordingly to those feelings. So you can see how these all kind of progress towards each other. So once you're kind of self-aware, and you also have self-regulation, then you are able to become better in social circumstances. Now you're understanding how people feel, and you can respond in a way that is meaningful to them. To be empathetic means to pay attention to their emotions. Are they upset? Are they stressed? Are they angry? How can you interact with them because of that? And can you empathize with them? Recognize that they're going through something difficult and you want to understand why they're going through something difficult. Listen to others and embrace their differences. People are going to be different than you and embrace that. Respond appropriately to others' emotional states. Sometimes we just need to adapt and adjust. It's not appropriate to act in certain ways when someone is feeling certain ways. We need to be able to respond appropriately to those. Okay, so to improve our empathy, a few things. Be willing to share your own thoughts and emotions. It's hard to be empathetic with others if you're not willing to talk about your own emotions. So let those things out, and people can relate better to you as well. It's kind of a two-way exchange there. Surround yourself with people of varying backgrounds, cultures, languages, and worldviews. We tend to be less empathetic when we're always around people that think and act exactly like us or that are very similar to us. It's helpful to travel a bit, to work with people that are from different cultures and backgrounds, to provide community services in places where people are maybe have a different upbringing or background. Work with people that have a different native language than your own. But the more you work around people of varying backgrounds, the more likely you are to become empathetic and to understand people's stories and their challenges and their differences. So really work on being around a variety of different types of people. And then again, learn those active listening skills. We're actually going to go into more about active listening skills in Module 2, so stay tuned for that. But learn to listen actively with those that you're around. And then talk to people you haven't met is usually a good way to become more empathetic. The more you understand how different people think and act and are, the more likely you are to be able to become empathetic to those that you're working with and around. Okay, so empathy is that fourth area. Imagine yourselves in other situations and think about how you would react. Okay, the last one then is motivation, the ability to become or to be action focused and seeking intrinsic rewards without necessarily expecting money, fame, or recognition. It's learning to improve and achieve. So this is the last and maybe in some ways the most difficult area of emotional intelligence to achieve, but it's being self-motivated, motivated to do things because they're meaningful to you, not because someone's going to pay you or because you're going to get some kind of recognition. All those things can be helpful and nice, and they're not necessarily bad, but motivation, just for the sake of being motivated, helps us really become in control of our emotional state and why we do things and who and what we do those things for. So to become self-motivated means that we pursue activities that are personally meaningful to us. We're engaged in activities that make us excited about what we're doing. It means to aim to improve areas where you notice weakness. Recognizing when you do something that's not great in whatever that capacity that is. When we're talking about communication, maybe you recognize that you're not a great writer or not a great speaker or not a great designer or something like that. Well, aim to improve in those areas where you notice weakness. That's kind of self-motivation. I can get better at this, so I'm going to work on that. And then also work on finishing what you start. A lot of us have great ideas. A lot of us start projects, but the more you can finish what you start, the more you start to recognize the value of that in your life and in your work. Okay, so just a few tips for improving your motivation. Avoid focusing solely on extrinsic rewards. Again, things like money and recognition. Set measurable goals and achieve them. Tell yourself, okay, I'm going to do this by this week, by this month, by this year, and achieve them. The key there is that they're measurable. You're not setting yourself up for failure, although there's nothing wrong with some failure. Failure is good. But you want to make goals that you can achieve so that you're making progress towards things. See accomplishment as a process, not necessarily an achievement. We're always working to get better, but there's not some end result where we're gonna arrive where we've done everything we need to. But we're always gradually improving, which is a good way to be thinking about progress rather than perfection or mistake-free or failure-free. We're thinking about always just kind of moving in the right direction. Which comes to that next point: embrace failure as a part of the process. If you can be conscious of and expect failure to happen in your life, then you're more adaptable when it happens. Recognize that failure is a learning process that actually does make us better. It's good to fail. So expect that and embrace it as a part of the process. And then collaborate to help hold yourself accountable. When you're working towards goals, maybe work on the similar goals with somebody else so that you can help bounce ideas off of each other, so that you can motivate each other. Um, okay, so we've talked about a few things. All these concepts of emotional intelligence probably feel more outside of the realm of business communication. So let's kind of pull these things together and talk about how this all works. High emotional intelligence will make you a better communicator. And so I'm going to share this thought with you from Mark Davis Jr., an author and a part of EDUCAUSE. He says, those who leverage emotional intelligence have a greater ability to influence, persuade, and connect with others, which ultimately is all about the way we communicate. Keep in mind, while emotional intelligence may not come naturally to some of us, it is a critical skill that can be learned and practiced by anyone who needs to build and maintain strong, effective relationships. This is especially important for those in positions where they need to manage, lead, influence, and successfully engage others. You can see in this thought here, I've highlighted several areas about how emotional intelligence helps us: influencing, persuading, connecting. It's a thing that can be learned and practiced, but then also, if we want to manage, lead, influence, and successfully engage others, we have to be good at emotional intelligence. And you can see all those things directly relate to communication as well. The better we are at emotional intelligence, the better we will be as communicators. So that is the end of Module 1. So we'll move next into Module 2. We have, to this point, talked about a variety of ways to think about communication today, communication at work, the way that we persuade audiences, and the way we think about emotional intelligence. So this is the big, broad overview of communication. Now we'll get into more specifics next in our team communication module. We'll see you in the next segment, in the next module.